the value creators, we favor a much different business model than the one that's traditionally taught in business schools or written about in business books. It focuses on value. Value is experienced by customers. It's entirely subjective. You can't put numbers on it, you can't capture it in a plan, you can't distribute it to shareholders. It's not a thing at all. We build the value creators system on a sound foundation of economics. In today's episode, we're going to explore that foundation and the sound understanding of value that it gives us. I'm going to introduce a word, subjectivism. Sounds very wonkish, I know, but it's key to our understanding of the value creators business model.
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
To talk about subjective value and subjectivism, our guest today is Professor Mark Packard. He's the research director of the Madden Center for Value Creation, and he teaches at the College of Business and Management at Florida Atlantic University. He's the author of Entrepreneurial Valuation, an entrepreneur's guide to getting inside the minds of customers. Mark, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Hi, Hunter. Glad to be here.
We're going to talk today about subjectivism. You're an expert in that area of philosophy and economics, let's call it. To some people, it sounds like goofy nerd stuff, but in fact, as we'll discuss, it's absolutely crucial to business success. And it's different thinking. It's certainly different than the way business is normally taught. So let's start with an introduction. Tell us about subjectivism and its basics, and let's go from there.
Let me start with maybe positivism, which is its counterpart. I could go on for a long time on the history of the philosophy of science, but I'll try to keep it brief. So really what we're interested in here is the philosophy of social science, and that will be important in a second. But positivism was originally proposed and developed by a man named Auguste Comte, who argued that social science was essentially ready at that time for a final, what he called a positive turn away from what he saw as a dogmatic pursuit of first causes. He figured it would narrow its focus on the laws of nature that govern social phenomena. And in effect, Comte was really a subjectivist. He thought of social science in terms of subjectivist thought, right? He called for a subjective method where it would be understood that social reality is actually constructed by science, by the social scientist. There isn't some underlying determinism causing the social world to be as it is, but we make sense of our social reality with the concepts we construct. And so we can actively work to improve those concepts, which was the primary task of social science. So yeah, that was Comte who really got positivism off to a good foot. And it was very popular out of the modernist movement of the Enlightenment. But when World War I broke out, a lot of the European academic heritage got disrupted by the war, and there were some significant shifts in the academic circles, and theories that would come out of them were pretty interesting. In that shift, there arose that Vienna Circle, if you've ever heard of that. And in that circle, Vienna Circle, they basically advanced what they called neo-positivism, or more commonly, logical positivism. And that was kind of spearheaded by Rudolf Carnap. And the logical positivists basically thought that there's an objective truth, that the goal of science, including social science, is to progressively get us to that truth. And so scientists would incrementally strip away the imprecise ideas and concepts and replace them with more correct knowledge through empirical science, through that revered scientific method with a capital S and M. But what's interesting is that in philosophy, logical positivism has almost been totally rejected. But philosophy's rejection of it happened a couple of decades after it had already totally caught on in the social sciences. I should say that it didn't catch on in sociology, since Max Weber, who was kind of the father of sociology, was a subjectivist. But it did catch on in psychology and economics. In fact, it was actually Milton Friedman who really turned the tide in economics to positivism, making it an empirical science, at least purportedly. Now, the reason that most philosophers rejected positivism, logical positivism, that is that there's a clear and obvious difference between physical reality and social reality. And this is what the subjectivists have always argued, right? You can't study people and their interactions the same way that you study rocks and energy, because people are conscious. There's a famous quip by Mises. I don't know where it comes from. I only seen it cited by others, but he once said, this isn't verbatim, throw a rock in the water and it sinks. Throw a stick in the water and it floats. But if you throw a man in the water, he must choose whether to sink or swim. Right? And that's just basically what subjectivism is, right? If we're thinking intentional beings, then we're not the sole product of observable factors. We ourselves, whoever we are, we have a say in what we do. You don't get to blame fate or blame the devil or even your biology for what you do, right? You're responsible for your actions because you chose them. Now, this probably seems intuitive and obvious for most listeners, but it's actually a radical conclusion in social science, right? There's actually a pretty large contingent of social scientists that reject free will. And, that's fine. But even if you think free will is an illusion, we're not in a place in science to actually conclude that. And so, as long as we're not, the moral or ethical position, even the scientific position is to accept free will and voluntarism, that we ourselves choose our actions. And I'll tell you why. There's 3 reasons. First, science doesn't actually justify the rejection of free will. I've reviewed the evidence. Some of it's pretty compelling, but it all rests on assumptions that aren't really justified scientifically, right? I can go into some of the specifics if you want, but we don't know if free will exists or not. And there's actually a lot of interesting evidence for free will too, right? When someone does a study in psychology or in economics, there's always a ton of what we call unexplained variance in the model, right? These are the outliers of the data set that the theoretical model doesn't explain. And it's always the case, always, right? And this variance is where people don't actually behave as the theory predicts, is actually evidence of free will, right? That we don't follow the script of the inputs to its theoretical conclusion, right? We get to choose. And then third, and probably the most important, well, maybe not, I don't know. If you tell people that free will is an illusion, they'll start shirking responsibility for their actions. They'll lie, cheat, and steal. And there's actually quite a bit of scientific evidence of this, right? It's very established in the literature. And so we don't want that. So the ethical obligation, I think, and the scientific obligation is toward voluntarism. So subjectivists argue that we can't study social phenomena like the physical sciences do. We can't use the same scientific method because our objects of study are people. And so we have to do social science differently. People choose their values, they choose their beliefs, they choose their intentions, and we can at any moment change our minds. So even if we could somehow get into the minds of people, which is actually impossible despite what some people believe, and get a hold of, what economists call their utility functions, our predictions would still tend to fail, right? And subjectivists have been totally validated by the recent reproducibility crisis. Have you heard of that?
Yes, a little bit. Certainly in psychology and some social sciences, right? The
Yeah.
experiments
So
can't be proven because they can't be reproduced.
they tried to replicate 100 of psychology's most important studies, and only 40 of them replicated. And they found similar problems in management, in economics. People aren't robots that respond predictably to inputs, right? We choose our behaviors. And those choices reflect deep differences in how we think about and see the world, what we value and what our goals are. And in some cases, participants of a study, like in psychology, for example, you might try to give them a goal, right? This is what your objective is in this situation, this game, this study. Who knows what they're thinking, right? They might actually be trying to mess up the study just for fun or something like that. We don't know what's inside their head. So So subjectivists and Austrians specifically have long argued that social science can't be a predictive science.
Let's bring that specifically to economics and business, because I've been reading a lot about the history of management and teaching in business schools, and that's based on the theory that business can be a hard science. It can be a predictive science. It can be managed. We can have plans. We can set out goals, and we can manipulate business in order to reach them, which is a positivist point of view, right? That's a business teaching is built on that idea.
I mean, yeah, because business is predictive, right? And so if we can improve our predictions, we can improve our chances of success. And so that's the attractiveness of positivism. But social science, it's not social engineering. We don't have control over our outcomes, right? And so the goal of science should be understanding, and the goal of business is a little different than what we often think of it. Like, the problem with positivism isn't just that it leads society towards socialism and the social calculation problem, which is what a lot of the Austrians and the Austrian acolytes tend to be worried about. My view is aligned with yours, that what's actually taught in business schools is faulty and problematic because it's based on positivism, and they're trying to unravel the secrets of success. But the big lie is that there is no secret. There's no checklist program to attain success. Follow my method and you'll be a millionaire, right? I mean, you can and should listen to success stories because you can learn a lot from them, but your own story will always be unique. You can't just do what others have done, which is really what business schools teach, right? They take examples, historical data, and they figure out which ones have worked best and create a success formula, right? But you have to figure out what works for you and your customers, right? Another, maybe to kind of illustrate one of those errors of positivism, you can look at big data and the overhyped promise of big data. The expectation is in a lot of circles that big data will let businesses know exactly what their customers will want and do, and so they can perfectly refine and tailor their product and basically virtually guarantee their success. But a subjectivist would be totally skeptical of this, right? Yes, big data can help you better understand your customer, but it's based in historic data, and the past only predicts the future if we don't change. But the whole point is we do change, and we change in unpredictable ways. And so the value of big data isn't going to be as great as long been touted. I think we're already seeing that.
Let me pick up on one word that you used earlier, Mark, and I wanted to cover it. So we can't know the future. We can't be predictive. Our resources are subjective. Our plans are subjective. But you use the word intent or intentionality. We can have intent. How does that fit into the subjectivist theory?
Intentionality is actually, I would say, the centerpiece of subjectivism. That intentions are individual is the reason so many things have a subjective character, right? Not everything has a subjective character, right? And things that don't are objective. We call them objective because our intentionality doesn't touch them, right? It doesn't matter what we think of the moon. It's just there. Whatever we think about it, whatever we mean by the moon is there no matter what we believe. But a marriage is intentional, right? We have created the institution of marriage for a purpose. And if we all suddenly stopped believing in marriage, then suddenly none of us are married, right? And so marriage is actually subjective and not objective. And to the extent that things depend on our believing in them and our intentionality, we keep believing in them because it's useful to believe in them in some sort of way, right? And so the subjective realm is comprised of intentional beliefs, while the objective realm is not.
So one of the areas we focus on a lot in subjectivism, and this brings us in squarely into business, is value. And that the positivist view of value, if I could say it this way, is that businesses produce things of value and they get paid for them. And you would say the opposite, right? There's nothing intrinsically valuable in what is produced. It's all decided by the consumer with their subjectivist evaluation. So talk about value and subjective value.
Most of your listeners have probably heard that value is subjective. It's well known, it's well established, even by positivists, right? So if value is subjective, what does that mean? for most people, from that positivist framework, it just means that people have different utility functions, that a rock has different value for different people because we're different, right? And so the rock's utility is heterogeneous because people are different. But in this sense, for every person, there's a unique but objective personal utility. But for subjectivism, the view of value here is very different, right? Value doesn't exist in the rock. The rock isn't per se valuable. In fact, the concept of intrinsic value is actually a myth. Things don't have value at all. They're valued, right? We value things because what we think they can do for us is important to us, right? So value isn't a noun, it's a verb from the subjectivist perspective, right? So as a business, you need consumers to value your product or service. You're not creating value. Your consumers hopefully value your product. And this flips the way you think about your business, right? You're not creating value. You have to facilitate a value experience for them. You're trying to figure out what they would value. In other words, you're trying to find a way to make their life better in a way that they would appreciate and would want it. So understanding value is subjective in the subjectivist sense rather than in the positivist sense really changes the way we think about business.
Yeah, in fact, I heard you say in one of our earlier conversations, I think value is life. We were born trying to figure out what to value. We constantly live searching for value. We're trying to learn, in your terminology, what to value. That's what life is. It's valuing.
Yeah, I mean, totally. If you think about it, why do you do anything, right? Anything and everything we do, it's to some purpose. We're pursuing a higher valued life, right? And this is a very Misesian point. So yeah, in my book, I develop a value learning cycle that explains how we as consumers learn over time what we value, what to want. The key point of this is exactly what I was saying earlier, that our so-called utility functions are not at all fixed or set, right? The aim is to keep improving what we believe, what we understand about value, what we value. And this is why we like to try new things, right? Sometimes we want the familiar because we know the value and we want it again. But sometimes we want to see if there's something else that might be even more valuable. And so we're always assessing our value experiences, revising and refining our opinions on what goods and services are most valuable to us. And this is kind of this virtual learning cycle.
Yep. So you mentioned your book, Entrepreneurial Valuation, and that takes us inside the corporation, the company, the firm. We sometimes call it the entrepreneur, but that can be a group or a team or a company. So let's go to the production side. How do we run a business? How do we approach a business under this rubric of trying to generate valuation by customers, which is positive for our business? There's nothing we produce that's valuable. So how do we go about business?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. That's the key challenge, right? Consumers value products, so your success depends on them valuing your product. And so how do you ensure that they do that? Well, the scientifically accurate answer is that you can't. They choose what to value. You don't really have a say in it. But not having a say in it doesn't mean that you can't influence it, that you can push things in the right direction, right? For example, we know from the human action axiom that what consumers will choose will be that which they expect to be the best option for them, right? That which they think will be the most valuable relative to what they have to give up to get it, right? So if you can figure out what they would value more than the other options, then there's a good chance that they'll pick you, right? Of course, they have to be convinced that it's more valuable, which can be tricky, especially if they're more familiar with the other options, right? If you're a brand new, unfamiliar product and the others are established brand names. But that's essentially the goal, to give consumers something that they will value and see that value more than the alternatives. And this isn't just a marketing challenge. You may be able to persuade them through like hard marketing or maybe even deceit to try your product. But if it doesn't actually deliver that value experience that you're promising, they're not coming back and they're giving you a bad review. And so it is this the cycle of actually having something that will be valuable to them in their experience and not just in their perception.
Yeah, and one of the things we say is, you talked about marketing, but that the whole company needs to think in terms of subjective value, whether you're on the production line or you're the truck driver or the accountant, that what you do is an attempt to have customers evaluate in a positive sense, and turn that into willingness to pay, as you call it. So the company has to build up subjective knowledge resources. That's a way to say that. And we've talked about this before, but let's cover it again. Empathy is a tool in that sense. I can't get inside the consumer's head, but I can empathetically diagnose what they're thinking and feeling. Did I say it right?
Right. So you're trying to create something that will facilitate a value experience for your customer. So how do you know what will do that? You have to understand your consumer and what their needs are, their value experiences are like. So yeah, that requires what we call empathy. Now, the challenge with empathy is that it's always impossible to know for sure what someone else's experience will be like, right? You can do a quick thought experiment to demonstrate that, right? So let's say that we're both looking at a red ball. I don't have a red ball here, but yeah, I'll ask you, hey, what color is this ball? And you say red, and I agree. We both see it as red, but how do I know that what you see as red isn't what I would experience as blue? How do we know that we experience redness in the same way? And when you think about it, you realize you can't know. You can't get that. I can ask you about it. I can try to get you to describe it, but it'll always fall short. These types of experiences can't really be explained in any way. And so we call this tacit knowledge. And so this type of experiential knowledge amounts to a big hurdle to your empathy with consumers, right? Because that is what you're trying to get from your consumers, their value experience. But you can do some things to improve your empathy, which, I'm happy to talk about if you want to go in detail.
Yes, please do. But help us with another tool here, and maybe it's part of empathy, and that's the feedback loop. We can get information back from the customer. Maybe you'll talk about what form that comes in. But that starts to me, Mark, to feel a bit positivist. I'm thinking like a machine.
The
I
feedback.
make a prompt and I get a feedback loop and I can process that. So have I stepped over the subjectivist bounds?
Well, no, not exactly. I mean, learning is feedback. Our experiences are feedback for us, right? We have a psychologists call a mental model of reality, and we are testing our mental model of reality all the time with our experiences and refining it. And value is one of those mental models that we have. We're testing our expectations of value with our experiences. So empathy is certainly, and our perceptions of consumers are certainly the same way. So yeah, getting feedback from consumers is important, but that's not as easy as it sounds. Like, oftentimes business consultants and business professors will talk about, market research and getting feedback and doing surveys, etc. That's not very good feedback because it's not really getting at what the actual need experience is, right? You have to really understand not just if they're happy about or satisfied with your product. You need to know how they're experiencing it if you want to keep improving it and improving it in a way that really matters. And so you need to go deeper. And how do you do that? Well, it's not easy. First of all, it matters who you empathize with. It's hard to empathize with people that are very different from you. If you pick a consumer segment that is more like you, in their background, in their interests, in their worldview, etc., you can empathize better with those people, which is potentially one reason if you want to really have a big appeal to a lot of customers to have a diverse market research team. Another thing you could do is spend quality time with your customers, actually get into their lives a bit and see how they live and experience things. They can't exactly tell you what it's like for them, but they can tell you a lot about it, which can help you really better imagine what it might be like for them. So those are some of the things you can do. But yeah, getting feedback is important. It's just, we're not talking about a check mark on a survey, right?
So is there any deduction here, Mark? You talk about spending time in their lives. We sometimes talk about ethnography, following them around and observing. But if I say, how are you feeling about this? How does this make you feel? That sounds a bit artificial. How do I deduce their feelings?
They will tell you, and then what they tell you, you can mentally simulate, imagine for yourself that type of experience in that context as if you were them. That's what really empathy is. So that's helpful, but all you have to use to simulate that is your own past experience of those types of emotions and feelings. And so you don't know if you're experiencing it in the same way they are, but at least it gets you closer, gets you a better chance at it. And so all that nuance is useful if you can get to it.
So let's take this to the next practical level. I'm in a business. I'm trying to grow it. I'm sensitive to this empathy. I'm looking for a customer need. I'm trying to figure out how to meet that need. How do I turn that into real business action, especially at scale? And I think this is where you said in the past you can combine customer knowledge or customer understanding or customer empathy with technical knowledge, and the result becomes great business. Is that a good place to start?
Subjectivism and understanding subjective value, subjective resources, and everything. This understanding of business recenters our focus on your customers. And note that I said customers plural because they aren't all the same. They may value different things. They may even value your product for very different reasons. And so keep that in mind as you try to improve your product and your value proposition for your different customers. But all the other things businesses, their efficiency and cost, the employee management, their investors, and all that's important, but it's all secondary to first getting customers to love your product, because that's your primary stakeholder, because they pay all the bills. And another point that it helps us see is that you should probably be less resource focused. If it's about making the best value experience for your customers, figure out how to do that in the absolute best way possible at the minimum expense to your customer. And that may entail totally doing it differently than has been thought before, right? Don't just assume that the old way of doing it is the best way. Can you use other materials? Can you think of a different type of design that would do the job better? Can you maybe invent new resources? So you want to be thinking entrepreneurially in that way at all times. And these 2 points are basically what you were getting at. Those are the 2 types of knowledge that entrepreneurs have to have in order to innovate. And, which again, like you said, I call them needs knowledge and technical knowledge. So needs knowledge is understanding the needs and value experiences of consumers. And then technical knowledge is knowledge about resources and materials and capabilities that can be, and their properties and what they can do. So innovation comes at the intersection of that, where you understand a problem and understand technologies and properties that can be used to solve that in a different way that could be better. So you want to keep learning both types of knowledge over time to keep improving and innovating.
Yeah, and I try to think about how we apply this at scale. A couple of examples come to mind. One is Amazon.com. I'm always amazed at the economics of delivery. I can get things delivered to my home the same day. There's no way in the past we could have conceived of that as even possible. But Amazon's figured out a way to do that, create enormous value in my mind to know that I can expect the delivery in the same day. So would that be an example of understanding a consumer need? I could call it consumer need high time preference.
Yeah, so sure. The chance to scale depends on finding something that just about everyone wants that you can do better than anyone else. That is not easy. The challenge is that everyone already satisfies their various needs in comfortable, familiar ways. We're in an advanced stage of civilization where we're not, missing our basic needs very, very much, right? We're dealing on the margins here. And so you have an uphill battle to convince the masses to abandon their familiar solutions, which is, this is where that diffusion S curve shows up, right? So to get past just the first stage of diffusion, you have to cross the chasm that Jeff Moore talked about, which a lot of innovations and ventures fall into. Are your listeners familiar with the chasm concept?
We'll cover it again. We've mentioned it before, but let's cover it again.
Okay. Basically, Jeff Moore observed that the diffusion S curve that has, the early adopters, the early majority, the late adopters, the laggards, right? It's concatenated for a lot of innovations and ventures, right? They never really diffuse into the early majority. They just start. There's a little bit of interest, but then it peters and the business fails, the venture fails, and it never really makes it across what he calls a chasm. So getting across that chasm, it really depends on understanding value as subjective. This is my argument, right? So this is where subjectivism and subjective value really helps us, right? Because Moore argued that getting over the chasm would require guerrilla marketing tactics to spread the word far and wide. But that conclusion is based on positivist theory, where the only plausible reason people don't adopt the product is because they don't know about it. But that's not really reflective of reality. There's a lot of things that we wait to buy, not because we don't know about it, but because we're uncertain about its value. So to cross the chasm, guerrilla marketing might help. Yes, absolutely. But it's really about having clearly superior value to what's already out there so that consumers' uncertainty is reduced. Who do consumers trust more about new products? Other consumers, right? So it's really the early adopters. They're the early adopter subjective value experience that really matters the most for getting across that chasm and achieving scale. Like, for example, Ben and Jerry's, Krispy Kreme, they achieve scale without spending a dime on marketing, right? They reach scale because their customers raved about their product. And so that's what you really need is, if you're only just a little bit better, you're going to have a hard time getting over that chasm.
One of the examples that comes to mind is Tesla. And I heard somebody talk about Tesla. We're trying to figure out Tesla marketing. And as you say, there is none. It's Elon, and it's somebody said to me, it's a cult. What they did was created a cult of users at the beginning who are absolutely passionate about Teslas for some reason. And now the cult is spreading. The cult is getting bigger and bigger. Tesla's spending or selling more and more units. So maybe we should all be trying to create a cult, Mark. Is that a way to think?
If you can do it, that'd be great. Yeah. But the trick is you have to have that much better a value experience that you will have a cultish reaction to it, right? So that cultish devotion comes from an intense value experience that is so much better than what they've had before. And it causes not just a lot of, that very satisfactory experience, right? But such a big experience like that also creates an emotional attachment to the product and its creators. So that's what Apple has. That's what Tesla has. And so that's what you want to aspire to, but that's hard to do because finding something that is that much better than what it exists is tricky, right? You need to spend a lot of time figuring out what real underlying need and the value experience before you take it to market. So a lot of people go to market too soon if they want to get this. But if you've got something that's just kind of a niche thing, you don't necessarily need to do that. But if you want scale, that is what I would recommend.
Is there an element of luck anywhere here? Looking at the case studies, looking backwards, you look at the Amazons and the Teslas, and as you said, many businesses fail. They fail to get beyond the chasm, let's say. We can have intent. You've mentioned that, but is there luck as well? There's unpredictability that amounts to luck?
Yeah, honestly, most of the business successes that we see out there were actually lucky. Honestly, they wouldn't say they were lucky, but But they took a bet on an idea that turned out to be valuable to consumers, right? Maybe it's because they did have some superior insight into what consumers really value. But honestly, a lot of them just get there on a prayer, right? While so many others fail, right? Everybody thinks they have a good idea, that they have an insight into what consumers will want, but most of them fail. And so they're banking on an idea that is not well established in a very deep subjective value understanding, right? And so yeah, a lot of it out there is luck, and like you kind of said, luck always will play a role because we can't be certain. We don't know the consumer's mind, and so we can only get closer and closer. But honestly, I don't think Steve Jobs was lucky. If you listen to how he thought about his customers and products, he understood subjective value. This understanding of consumers doesn't guarantee success, right? There's always some uncertainty. But Jobs was so focused on the consumer experience that he put himself in just about as good a position as anyone to succeed. Jeff Bezos too, right? Amazon is extremely customer experience focused. So yeah, paraphrasing Per Byland a little bit, all of the biggest, the longest lasting business dynasties figured out subjectivism and subjective value. And so they thrive because they're learning entrepreneurial and customer centric, right? And it's when those big companies lose that subjectivist impulse, when they rest on what they end up seeing as their objective value, that they tend to fall from grace, like Sears and like Kodak.
Yeah, I like what Jeff Bezos used to say in the past, that no one ever said to me, Jeff, I'd like it slower or more expensive or lower quality. So he was thinking about the customer experience all the time. How can we reverse that, make it faster and cheaper and even better? And as you said, Jobs was always thinking about the customer experience, but he also said, when somebody asked him about the secret of success, he said, I'm waiting for the next big thing. Eventually it came along, but he didn't predict it. He waited for it.
There's two options. I mean, someone's got to make it, right? And so if you want to really break the ground, you got to get into your customer's head. You got to really be empathic and understand that experience and be innovative. And really, if you're going to really compete in an industry that is already full of big brand names, you might have to do it that way. But there's a lot of value that you can facilitate for consumers using technologies that others create. If you can just see a different way of adapting it to improve their lives. So you can do it both ways.
One of the ways that emerges out of science these days in complexity theory is run lots of experiments. Do them fast, do them low cost, and see what happens. That doesn't sound positivist to me. It's not predicting the future. It's experimenting to see what the future will be. Does that fit your thinking about business, Mark?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not unaligned with the way we think about it. It is an admission that our predictions are likely wrong, or that we don't know, and so it's fast adaptive. The problem with that is it's very expensive, and it's hard to, if you are just getting off the ground with very few resources, you can't really afford to do that type of. And so the cheaper solution is to just really get to know consumers at a deep level. Solve maybe your own problems as a consumer, where your problems are very confidently reflective of others, so that you understand what other people are going through, or something like that. You can save initial resources doing it that way. But yes, don't be too wedded to your first idea, because you're almost certainly going to be at least a little bit wrong. And so the faster and more often you can adapt to what you're learning over time, the better your product will be.
Let's see if we can tie this up a little bit, Mark. How do we get better? How do we build that capability? Well, your friend Bart Madden, you teach at the Madden Center for Value Creation, says it's knowledge building. You run those experiments, you interact with customers, you learn. You've used that a lot, and you learn at speed, and you process that learning to get to the next step. So that's a cycle kind of a vision, constantly learning from feedback. Is there a way to get better at that, to be a better knowledge builder than somebody else?
Just understanding subjectivism and how all of this works changes the way you learn. And so let me encourage listeners to check out my book, Entrepreneurial Valuation, because that one steps through the theory and then it goes through several techniques to improve your empathic learning, your innovative ideation through an understanding of subjectivism, right? And so I also talk about how you can better manage uncertainty. So yeah, I think it is possible and we're making progress on that end.
Good. Well, I know you and I share the goal, Mark. We want to change the teaching of business and how business is conducted. We want to make it subjectivist and utilize all of those great insights and techniques that you've talked about. So we look forward to working together on doing that. Mark, thanks very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a pleasure.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode, and check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.